Hey there, my name is Nate Ridgway, and welcome to our latest vlog here for inventive and hopefully some clever ways that you can use Classtime in your teaching. Today in our vlog, we're going to be talking here about supporting evidence questions and really kind of how to write good questions in and of themselves and why these kind of questions, the ones that have our students use evidence that are pulled from passages or texts that they're reading, are really fundamental and really important to their learning experience. So where I kind of wanted to start today is kind of actually giving you kind of the way that I kind of arrived at talking about this topic. So I started teaching in 2014 as a special education teacher in a middle school setting, and now I teach a actual high school history course for sophomores and juniors, both a world history and kind of a dual credit kind of upper level setting as well. And when I was thinking about just recently those two different jobs, one with middle schoolers with special education and the other with history with high schoolers, which seemingly have nothing in common, I thought about something that actually both of them really shared and both really emphasized for students, and that was the importance of being able to take a text and pull evidence from it and be able to use that evidence convincingly in an answer. And so today, when I was thinking about Classtime and how I was using it with students, I thought that this would be a really good opportunity to take a moment and explain why we should actually improve and look at how we're teaching with evidence-rich readings and texts in mind. Now, first things first here, I do not want this to be a vlog, and I want to be very careful about this, about why we need more evidence-based assessments and reading assessments. No, not at all. I think that we, and teachers especially, just generally have way too many assessments on their hands. I know in my school alone, out of the 180 days that we have in our school year, over 50 of them are set aside for testing. And so teachers are already overloaded with this problem. Instead, I want you to kind of think of this as instead of increasing the assessment landfill, how can we better recycle and revamp the tests that we've already got going on? So with that being said, we're going to try to kind of accomplish three kind of things here specifically, and I'll go ahead and highlight these on the screen just so you can better see them. First, I want to explain the recent phenomenon with nonfiction texts, which of course, because they're about the real world out there, whether that's science or history or anything in between, kind of lend themselves to those kind of supporting evidence style questions. And then second, I want to talk about for you, whether you're using Classtime or actually just giving these actual assessments in your own room, how can you write better types of supporting evidence style questions? And then third, once you've actually have assessed them, what can you do to actually improve your students' abilities to look at supporting evidence and be able to use that convincingly in an answer. So first things first, why nonfiction texts have become such a big thing. Now, again, the reason why I'm going to talk about this here is because nonfiction texts have a lot to do with, using and justifying evidence. Not to say that fiction doesn't have these things, but it does deserve some mentioning of why has nonfiction become such a big thing in the last, especially 10 or 15 years or so. So in the United States here, if you're not familiar with the actual curriculum that most states in the United States use, most of them use something called Common Core. And Common Core came around in 2010, and really what Common Core tried to do, just kind of broadly synthesizing here for you if you're not familiar with that, that change when it happened, was that it tried to kind of balance readers' meaning students' experience with both fiction and nonfiction. So if you're not kind of familiar with this, or maybe you haven't spent a lot of time, maybe you're not even a teacher of reading, even though maybe you've had your students obviously reading in your classroom, is that students really often prefer fiction. They tend to, they're going to go onto a bookshelf, at your local bookstore, or be browsing online, or, pick up something that's in their room or in your room. They're going to probably pick something that is not true, or, something that is a made-up story. However, what Common Core tried to do was try to increase students' exposure and time that they were spending with nonfiction texts. So I guess the first thing that we should immediately address is should, or really is it worth my time to spend additional time with my students doing nonfiction texts and things with evidence? And the answer that most researchers have is absolutely yes. And I'm just going to cite a couple of studies here that actually kind of back this up. So students, these studies say, who interact with informational and nonfiction texts develop background knowledge, which Marzano says affects up to 1/3 of the variance in students' achievement. They're more likely to earn higher grades in certain college courses, and they're also, according to Caswell and Duke, have increased motivation to read when they can examine areas of personal interest. And for me, this last one is especially true, where if you know that, for example, like your students are really interested in robotics and you can give them a reading that's based on that, and of course, a reading that has some questions about supporting styles of evidence, the students are going to be more likely and more motivated to read that particular subject. That just kind of should make sense. However, the thing that we now need to accomplish is actually, like, should our students be reading nonfiction and informational texts, like after we've determined that, should they be reading them? Yes. Like, we need to be very, very careful about the questions that we actually design with them. Because simply put, like, if the questions are too easy, we've really, like, wasted our time. Like, if a student can look at an assessment and be like, this evidence is too easy, Mr. Ridgway, like, this is, like, I haven't, like, I could have been doing something else with the other 10 or 15 minutes that I couldn't have been doing here. And that's a completely valid criticism. But on the other hand, like, if we give them an assessment that's really, really hard, for example, I've asked them to, like, do a whole bunch of inferencing or reading between the lines, connecting the dots, those kind of things, the only thing that we've measured with that assessment is how frustrated our students can get, which also is a waste of our time. So what I'm going to do here, and I highly recommend that as I'm talking about some of these different styles of questions and how we can kind of make them more rigorous for students, is to follow along. There's a copy here of my formative assessment that I've used with students that I'll be kind of referring to, and it's available here. And then also, if you'd like a link to the actual question set that I used on Classtime for this, that also is available in a link. Okay, so let's first of all define when you actually make an evidence, like, based and supporting evidence style question or assessment, what are the different types of questions that you can make? There's 3 different kinds, and these come from McKenna and Stahl, who kind of did a whole very, very well thought out and wonderful book on reading assessment back in 2015 that I'm going to refer to. So they identify 3 different kinds, and they get progressively more difficult here as we keep going. So the first kind they identify are literal questions. So these are questions that are directly in the text, that the information can be seen literally in black as it's written, and they will really only require superficial understanding. So in the example that I give students in the actual assessment that I did, it says, how many aircraft did the Japanese lose during the attack on Pearl Harbor? And this number 29 was mentioned directly in the reading that students did. So all I had to do was look right there. The answer is pretty obvious. Then the second type they identify is inferential questions, and these require the so-called, like, reading between the lines or connecting the dots. Now, there's a couple different styles that are within inferential questions, which I won't get into too much in depth. One is kind of that reading in between the lines, like where the evidence isn't directly stated. But then you can also have inferential questions where it asks students to make things like predictions or speculations or those kind of things. However, these questions are tougher than those literal questions because, again, like, the information isn't directly stated, it's implied. And so here, for example, I gave this one, Admiral Nagumo did not attack Pearl Harbor with a second wave because he thought that he would lose more planes in a second attack. Even though that wasn't directly stated in the text, students would have to use the surrounding evidence, whether that's certain options that the author was leaving out, or certain kind of, like, leading facts that kind of hints that the author was giving, to actually come up with that answer. The third type is really, really difficult, and honestly, you have to be really, really careful when you're doing this kind of question, like with supporting evidence assessments, and those are critical questions. And what we mean by critical is not that students are critically thinking. We mean critical as in, like, forming values about, like, what's right or wrong. And critical questions can be really tricky to assess because in terms of like valuing things right and wrong, these often come from personal beliefs and background experiences that each of us have had, and perhaps maybe our students haven't even had. So for example, like it questions like this, the last one that I ask students is like, based on this short reading, should Kennedy's argument be accepted as valid? Explain your thinking, why or why not. And again, like I may have students that say, yes, like this author's argument that they made in this passage should be taken as valid because blah, 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 blah. But then I might have another student who's read lots about Pearl Harbor or World War II or these kind of subjects and say like, no, like I've had this experience with this book, I know this evidence, I know this other perspective, and I don't see this, this new one as valid. And that's why these ones can kind of be tricky and difficult to assess. However, what I will tell you kind of in terms of actually sitting down and making your own questions is to think about kind of like it is a blend between an art and a science. Whether you're doing literal or inferential or critical questions and you're actually making a question set and sitting down and doing it, you need to kind of think of it like an architect and an engineer like working together. Architects, in terms of like what they do, not like, selling out architects here, is like they come up with, they can imagine any building, any test they want to design that comes up like in their mind's eye. Which is great because as teachers, like we should have the freedom to design and invent any kind of question that we think will help our students learn or help, assess and grow their skills. However, like then what an engineer does is they look at that question or that building that an architect has designed and they say like, should or can we really do this? Like, is this an appropriate building question, for our students to be able to conquer? Like, yeah, we could have a building made, entirely out of, duct tape, but is that the right actual thing to do with our students? Probably not. So that's kind of like what I would tell you to be kind of like the overall lens to writing questions for your students. Like, kind of have a blend between what's possible and what can or should I do. And again, like what I'm going to refer here to, kind of like here in the next instances, you want to be really, really careful about the cognitive load, continuing on the construction metaphor here, that your questions demand of your students. So for example, like some of them can put stresses on them that you might not even realize. And one of my favorite things that McKenna and Stahl brought up in their reading was that like when it comes down to like actual comprehension of a nonfiction text or passage or using evidence, like for example, like where does the supporting evidence of your passage come from? So if you give students a text and like, in thinking about and sitting down like, okay, actually, like what does each of my questions like evidence that they need to answer it, where does it come from? Like, does it come from students' background knowledge or both? Or does it come from or background knowledge or both? Does it come from their background knowledge or does it come from like the text itself or perhaps both? And what I mean by this is like, for example, I had this question in my assessment. This map, and there's a map you can go and you can see there, Japan, it seems to most confirm Kennedy's earlier argument that Japan's failure to destroy the U.S. oil reserves at Pearl Harbor would contribute to the U.S.'s ultimate victory over Japan. Now, I will have students in my upper level dual credit course who took this assessment who are really, really knowledgeable about U.S. history and World War II just because that's an area that they really found interesting and they've studied beforehand. However, I'll have other students that haven't had that experience, like in that exposure before. And so for them, like the answer to this question, for some of them is going to depend more on background knowledge because they might know lots about the, attack of Pearl Harbor. And for other students, like they're really, really relying upon the text-based evidence for things. One of my favorite examples that I saw when I was researching this book was the author in this passage was asking a question about like, Sally, when she heard the frog made the noise, and most of us would say, like ribbit or croak or something like that, just because we know from our background knowledge that frogs make that sound. Like, however, for students, like they are less or perhaps more text dependent depending on their background experiences that they've had with animals and whether or not they need to actually use the passage to be able to answer that question. So again, thinking about here like what could a hidden stress be on my students when I'm asking a question, this could be something that you definitely think about. Another one here too that you might want to consider when actually assessing your students on how they can use evidence is the vocabulary of your questions. Like, if a student gets a question wrong, it may not be because like they don't know how to use evidence. It simply could like be because they don't know the actual vocabulary of like either the answers that are provided that you've given them or the words in the question itself. So for example, like I had this question in my assessment, as used in line 55, dissenting most nearly means, and I give all these different answers and many of them seem correct: meaningless, important, oppositional, and defiant. And some of my students, when I did this actual assessment with them, chose defiant because dissenting can mean defiant. Like if you disagree, that can mean you have like a defiant approach towards something, which is perfectly fine. And some of them chose that simply because they had not been exposed to the word oppositional yet. It just wasn't in their lexicon. Now again, notice here, like, this is where we have to be really careful when we write an assessment, like just in general. Like, what skill are we actually assessing? Is your test assessing how, fluid and how expansive their vocabulary is? Or is it actually assessing their ability to pull evidence from a passage and use it? My recommendation at the end of the day, no matter really what kind of test you're doing, whether it's supporting evidence questions or if it's fictional texts, that you're looking at, is to stick with McKinnon and Stahl's KISS. And KISS, as an acronym, it means keep it simple, stupid. Like, we want to make sure that the actual wording of the questions and the answers that we give students is not going to be a barrier to them being successful. We don't want those to get in the way of our students expressing what they know and the skills and things that they can do. So that's my end of the day, the recommendation that I have. Now, if you've done an assessment with students, you've gathered all the information that you need to know about how they can use supporting evidence, what can you actually do to help your students do better on these kind of assessments and hopefully kind of improve these skills in the future? And what I've done here is I've pulled 6 of my favorite interventions from McCarney's et al.'s like pre-referral intervention manual. And these are kind of like go-to guides if I need to troubleshoot something in class. This is one of my favorite books to go to for that. And all of these, again, are based upon like actual evidence-based practices that help students be able to use supporting evidence in passages. So let's just read through them here real quickly. The first one of my favorites: have your students pretend to be detectives and play a game called Prove It. After reading a selection, identify the main idea. Then the students must quote-unquote prove it by retelling the supporting details that were in the text. Kind of an interesting idea, kind of like make-believe pretend, really, really good for younger students. The next one, read a text with students 3 times. First, give students time to read a selection once for fluency, so that way they can just read through it and hear the passage. Second, have them read for comprehension, so they can find the main idea. And then third, have them read through to find those supporting details. The third idea is actually one of my favorite ones, and that is reduce the amount of information that a student has to piece through. So again, like your text could have lots and lots of things like vocabulary or a really long introduction or other details that aren't necessary for them to be able to pull evidence. So for example, like eliminate sentences or paragraphs that aren't relevant for them to finding supporting details. Then number 4, have your students partner up and model for one another how to find supporting details. And this often will take the form of basically like what I call like a brain dump, where they're actually talking about like their thinking out loud that they're doing. So you'll have the students actually talk through like, okay, so I saw this statement and it looked like a main idea. So then I looked at the following sentence, because oftentimes I find that evidence comes after a main idea, and I pulled these particular points. Then, use text for your assessments that are of high interest to the students in your classroom. You can even substitute in their first names or known locations and make the text about them. So if you've got a nonfiction text about any given subject, like actually take the text and put in students' first names or details like your school that you teach in to make the passage more interesting, that hopefully can help them pull evidence easier. And then the last one is actually like a graphic organizer kind of idea, and kind of continuing on that construction metaphor. Have students write the main idea as the roof, of a house. So you actually have them draw the actual main idea and write it up like it's the roof of a house. And then below, as walls or the foundation, you have them actually insert and write out, so it kind of looks like a house, those supporting details. And that kind of helps students understand the idea that the supporting details actually prop up the main idea. So with all that being said, I hope that this vlog gave you some ideas about how you can and why you should do some evidence-based or supporting evidence style questions in your classroom, and hopefully how you can improve the tests you're already doing, and then also some teaching strategies and ideas that you can do once you've actually have done those assessments with your students. But until next time, happy assessing, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.